A gray April day chased its cold, wet wind across the dunes of the northern coast. It was a land that seemed to have forgotten the sun, a perpetual twilight of damp sand and shivering marram grass. For months, this strip of shoreline had been our world, a narrow cage of concrete and apprehension. From the slit of my command bunker, I could see the channel, a churning slate-gray expanse that promised nothing but misery to any sailor foolish enough to be upon it. The sea and the sky were one, an indivisible curtain of mist and spray. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with the smells of damp concrete, stale tobacco, and the slow, simmering anxiety of 46 men who had done nothing but wait. Our lot was highly unsatisfactory. We were a coastal defense unit, a title that sounded formidable on paper, but in reality meant we were the immobile bait, the tethered goat waiting for a tiger that might never come. The days bled into one another, distinguished only by the rotation of sentry duties and the quality of the watery stew served for the evening meal. The whole crowd, myself included, threatened to fly into a wild irritation, a collective cabin fever born not of confinement but of a profound and gnawing uselessness. My adjutant, a young lieutenant named Keller who still possessed the capacity for optimism, tried to keep spirits up. He was a good man, efficient and loyal, but his attempts at cheerfulness often grated on the nerves of the more seasoned soldiers. One of these was Sergeant Major Voigt, a man carved from old, hard wood, whose cynicism was as much a part of his uniform as his worn leather belt. He had been on 4 fronts and had seen empires rise and fall in the mud of forgotten fields. He saw no glory here, only a slow, damp decay. The generals sit in their chateaux with their maps and their brandy. He would grumble, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. They draw their little arrows, and we sit here and rust. He was not wrong. The official reports that crackled over the radio spoke of strategic realignments and tactical pauses, the grand, empty language of a high command that had lost touch with the reality of its men. They told us the enemy was deterred, that the weather conditions, a constant gale that churned the channel into a frenzy, made any large-scale landing impossible. They gave the all-clear, day after day, while the unstilled wind continued to blow its eternal song, a mournful dirge for men who were already ghosts. That night, the wind finally died. A strange, unnerving silence fell over the coast, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. The moon, a pale, sickly disk, appeared through a break in the clouds. It felt unnatural, a suspension of the laws of our world. I was in my small cot, trying to find sleep, when the sound began. It was not the familiar drone of a reconnaissance plane or the angry buzz of a fighter. This was a new sound, a deep, resonant roar that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. It was the sound of 1,000 hornets, of a sky filled with engines, a growing, all-encompassing tide of noise that swallowed the silence of the night. I was on my feet in an instant, pulling on my boots, my heart a cold stone in my chest. Outside the bunker, the world was bathed in a ghostly green light. Flares were hanging in the sky, dozens of them, then hundreds illuminating the clouds from below. And then we saw them, dark shapes, like seeds scattered by a careless god, were detaching themselves from the bellies of the aircraft, blossoming into parachutes against the spectral green sky. They were everywhere, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. The telephone in the command post shrieked, a frantic, piercing sound that cut through the roar from above. Keller snatched it up, his face pale in the flickering emergency light. His eyes were wide, fixed on the unfolding spectacle outside. "Major," he said, his voice tight, holding the receiver out to me. "It is headquarters." I took the Bakelite receiver. It felt cold and slick in my hand. The voice on the other end was tinny and frantic, distorted by static and panic. "Paratroops are dropping along the entire sector. Inland. Behind you. All units are to hold their positions and repel any landings on the coast." I repeat, hold the coastal defenses. The line went dead. Hold the coast? The thought was absurd. The enemy was not coming from the sea. He was already here, falling from the sky behind us, severing our lines of communication, surrounding us. The grand coastal wall, our concrete shell, had become a tomb. I looked at Keller, at Voigt who had appeared at my shoulder, his face a grim mask. There was no need for discussion. The orders were madness, the detached fantasy of a general looking at a map 50 miles away. We were cut off. Survival was now the only strategy. "We are not holding this position," I said, my voice flat and calm, a strange island of certainty in a sea of chaos. "We are breaking out. Inland. We will try to link up with the reserve division. Pack only what you can carry. Ammunition and water first. We leave in 5 minutes." Angrily, we packed our bundles. A frantic scramble to gather the meager essentials of our existence. The great landing had begun, and with it the end of our world. The retreat was not a retreat in any military sense. It was a flight, a desperate, disorganized scramble through a landscape that had become alien and hostile overnight. The familiar country lanes and quiet farmhouses of the past few months were now a labyrinth of fire and confusion. The air thrummed with the constant passage of aircraft, and the horizon flickered with the flashes of distant explosions. We moved in fits and starts, darting from the cover of one hedgerow to the next. Our small group of 20 men, a tiny, insignificant island in a torrent of chaos. Command and control had evaporated. Rumors flew like sparks in the wind. The enemy was here. No, they were there. A bridge was taken. A town had fallen. Every shadow held a threat. Every crossroads a potential ambush. We were blind, deaf, and alone. For 2 days we saw no one, friend or foe, only the evidence of their passing, abandoned vehicles, the bodies of men and animals, the smoldering ruins of a peasant's cottage. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion. Our emergency rations were quickly exhausted, and the water in our canteens grew warm and tasted of metal and fear. Exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on our shoulders, slowing our steps until we were shuffling like old men. On the 3rd day, we stumbled into a small, abandoned orchard. Apple blossoms, untouched by the madness around them, drifted down like snow. It was a moment of surreal peace. We collapsed under the trees, too tired to even post a proper guard. Voigt, ever the pragmatist, had found a muddy puddle in a ditch. He filtered the water through a piece of his shirt, offering it around. Tasted of earth and rot, but it was wet. It was life. As we lay there, a sudden burst of machine gun fire tore through the branches above our heads, showering us with leaves and splintered wood. We scrambled for cover, our movements sluggish and uncoordinated. They were on us before we could even understand what was happening. Soldiers, clad in uniforms of a different shade of green, emerged from the woods opposite the orchard. There were dozens of them, moving with a calm, professional efficiency that was terrifying. They did not shout or scream. They simply advanced, their weapons leveled. A young private near me, a boy of no more than 18, raised his rifle. Before he could fire, a single shot rang out, and he crumpled to the ground, a small, dark hole appearing on his tunic. There was no point. It was over. Voigt, lying beside me, slowly raised his hands. One by one, the others followed. I was the last. I laid my pistol on the grass and raised my own hands, the rough bark of the apple tree pressing into my back. The war, for us, had ended in a quiet, forgotten orchard. The soldiers who captured us were not the monsters of our propaganda. They were young men much like ourselves, tired and wary. They disarmed us with a practiced, impersonal detachment, patting us down for hidden weapons and taking our watches and any personal trinkets. There was no malice in it, merely the cold transaction of war. An officer, a captain who spoke our language with a clipped, academic accent, questioned me briefly. He wanted to know our unit, our strength, our objective. I gave him my name, rank, and serial number, nothing more. He nodded, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes, and then motioned for his men to lead us away. We were marched back the way we had come, back towards the coast. We joined a growing column of prisoners, a long, shuffling line of gray-faced men, a river of defeat flowing towards the sea. The guards were lenient, allowing us to help our wounded, sharing their cigarettes with those who asked. It was a strange, disorienting courtesy. We were no longer enemies, but simply cargo to be processed. The system, vast and indifferent, had absorbed us. It was as we crested a low hill overlooking the sea that I saw it. The sight stopped me in my tracks, and a guard had to shove me forward to keep the column moving. Below us, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other, was the fleet. It was not a fleet. It was a city on the water, a nation afloat. Hundreds upon hundreds of ships, of every size and description, lay at anchor. Massive warships, their guns bristling like the spines of some prehistoric beast, sat amongst a swarm of smaller transport vessels, landing craft and supply ships. Barrage balloons, like silver sausages, floated serenely above them. Smoke plumed from 1,000 funnels, creating a hazy, industrial pall that hung over the entire scene. Fighters and bombers circled endlessly overhead, the guardians of this immense, steel armada. It was a spectacle of such overwhelming power and industrial might that it defied comprehension. It was not just an invasion. It was the physical manifestation of a world's resolve, a logistical miracle that made our own efforts seem like a child's game played with tin soldiers. A successful invasion, I thought, with a cold, hollow certainty, was the beginning of the end. Everything we had done, every sacrifice, every drop of sweat and blood, was meaningless in the face of this. This was not a battle. It was an industrial process of annihilation. I stumbled forward, my eyes still fixed on the impossible vision before me. Voigt shuffled alongside me, his gaze also locked on the fleet. He had not spoken since our capture, retreating into a stony silence. Now he let out a low whistle, a sound of grim, reluctant admiration. "Well," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "That's that." Then he looked at me, his eyes, which had seen so much, now reflecting the vast gray panorama of the ships. "The war is lost," he said. It was not a question or a complaint. It was a statement of fact, as simple and irrefutable as the ground beneath our feet. He had known it, perhaps, for years, but now he was seeing the proof. I could only nod. There were no arguments left, no room for hope or defiance. The sheer, unanswerable mathematics of it all was laid bare before us. We had fought with shovels against a steam hammer. We were not soldiers anymore. We were the debris of a collapsed structure, waiting to be swept away. What we didn't know at the time, a piece of information which came into my hands only at the beginning of May 1987 through a historical journal, was that the initial assault wave alone consisted of over 5,000 vessels. 5,000. We had been guarding our little stretch of sand with 3 machine guns and a 75mm cannon that hadn't been fired in a year. The futility of it was so immense, it bordered on the comical. We were herded onto the beach, a wide, flat expanse of sand now transformed into a massive, chaotic staging area. Vehicles, crates of supplies, and columns of fresh troops were pouring ashore from the gaping mouths of landing craft. We, the prisoners, were an insignificant backwash in this tide of victory, a gray smear on the edge of the canvas. We were made to sit in a large, roped-off enclosure, guarded by a few bored-looking soldiers. Keller, my optimistic adjutant, sat with his head in his hands, the reality of our situation finally crushing his spirit. "What will happen to us, Major?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I put a hand on his shoulder. "We will be taken away," I said, "to a camp, somewhere else. That is our assignment from destiny now, Keller. We only have to survive the chaos." It sounded like a hollow platitude, but in that moment, it was the only truth I could offer. Our war of strategy and tactics was over. A new war had begun, a war of endurance, of patience, of waiting. Voigt seemed almost relieved. He had found a discarded tin of enemy rations and was meticulously examining its contents. "Look," he said, holding up a small, wax paper-wrapped biscuit. "A marvel of packaging. They have thought of everything." His gallows humor was returning, a sure sign that he was adapting. Survival, for him, was a series of small, practical problems to be solved. Find water. Find food. Stay alive. The grand, abstract cause was gone. replaced by the immediate physical reality of the body. A few days passed in the beach enclosure. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a dull, aching boredom and the constant, gnawing pangs of hunger. Our captors fed us, but the portions were meager, barely enough to keep a man on his feet. We were a nuisance, another logistical problem to be managed. Debates broke out among the prisoners. Some, the diehards, still spoke of resistance, of escape. Others, the majority, sank into a listless apathy. One evening, a group of men from another unit began to sing old folk songs. It was a pathetic, defiant gesture, their voices thin and reedy against the roar of the machinery on the beach. Another group of prisoners shouted at them to be quiet. A fight broke out, a clumsy, pathetic scuffle of exhausted men. Our guards watched with detached amusement before firing a few rounds into the air to restore order. It was a disgusting display, a microcosm of our defeat. We were turning on each other, our discipline and camaraderie dissolving under the pressure of captivity. I felt a profound sense of disgust, not at the men, but at the situation that had reduced them to this. These were soldiers who had fought bravely, who had endured years of hardship, now squabbling like children over nothing. The system had not just defeated us. It was unmaking us. Finally, the order came to move. We were marched down to a pier where a large transport ship was docked. It was an ugly, rust-streaked vessel, a merchantman hastily converted for military use. Its gray paint was chipped and peeling, and a foul-smelling smoke billowed from its single funnel. This, we were told, would be our home for the next few weeks. We were herded up the gangplank and down into the cavernous darkness of the cargo hold. The stench hit us like a physical blow, a nauseating combination of bilge water, unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and vomit. The hold was a vast, gloomy space, dimly lit by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Rough wooden bunks had been hastily erected in tiers, stacked so closely together that there was barely room to move between them. Thousands of men were already packed into this space, a dense, shifting mass of humanity. We were shoved into a corner, and the heavy steel hatch clanged shut above us, plunging us into a twilight world. The low, constant hum of the ship's engine started, and a deep vibration ran through the floor plates. We were moving. We were leaving our continent behind, cast out into the unknown. The journey across the ocean was a descent into a special kind of hell. The ship, unescorted and taking a long, circuitous route to avoid our own submarines, pitched and rolled relentlessly in the open sea. For the first week, nearly every man in the hold was violently seasick. The air became unbreathable, thick with the sour stench of vomit and human misery. The latrines, a few buckets in the corner, overflowed almost immediately. There was no escape from the filth, the noise, the smell. We were packed together like cattle, our bodies slick with sweat and grime. Blessed are they that sleep a long time, then they first notice later what has been tormenting the others for hours. The groaning of the ship's hull, the constant sloshing of the bilge, the retching of sick men, this was the soundtrack to our days and nights. Food was lowered down in large buckets, a foul-smelling slop that we ate with our hands. It was a daily humiliation, a reduction to the most basic animal level. The evening meal proceeded in a manner unworthy of human beings. Men fought over scraps, their faces grim and desperate in the dim light. I saw a former colonel, a man who once commanded a regiment, weeping quietly as he scraped the dregs from the bottom of a bucket. In the midst of this misery, our small group held together. We carved out a small territory for ourselves, a few square feet of filthy deck space. Voigt, with his unshakable pragmatism, became our provider. He had a knack for being in the right place when the food buckets came down, for trading a button from his tunic for an extra piece of bread. Keller, having recovered from his initial despair, tried to maintain a semblance of order, organizing a cleaning detail that was heroic in its futility. He would try to rally the men around us, his voice a small beacon of reason in the bedlam. "We are still soldiers," he would insist. "We must not forget who we are, but it was hard to remember you were a soldier when you were a listless bundle of flesh and bones." lying in your own filth. I spent most of my time in a state of semi-conscious torpor, my mind a blank slate. To think was to invite despair. It was better to drift, to let the hours and days merge into a single gray continuum of suffering. Yet even in this state there were moments of dark humor. We would take bets on who would be the next to succumb to seasickness, a malicious joy at a comrade's misfortune. It was a crude coping mechanism, a way of asserting some small measure of control over our wretched existence. One afternoon, a rumor spread through the hold. Icebergs. The ship had slowed, and the air filtering down from the vents had turned bitingly cold. Those who were strong enough to climb the ladders to the upper decks pressed their faces against the grates, trying to catch a glimpse. I felt a flicker of curiosity, a desire to see something other than the sweaty backs of the men packed around me. With Voight's help, I managed to pull myself up to a ventilation shaft. I peered through the metal slats and caught my breath. The sea, which had been a turbulent gray, was now calm and impossibly blue. Floating in this vast expanse were mountains of ice, majestic and terrifying. They were cathedrals of white and blue, their peaks sharp against the clear sky, their immense bulk hidden beneath the water. Our ugly ship seemed like a child's toy next to them. They drifted past in a silent, solemn procession, ancient and indifferent to our human squalor. The sheer, inhuman beauty of it was a shock to the system. It was a reminder of a world beyond our hold, a world of clean air and cold, majestic power. For a moment, the misery of our condition was forgotten, replaced by a sense of awe. Voight, next to me, grinned. "I see polar bears," he whispered loudly to the men below. "They are waving." A few weak chuckles rose from the darkness. Even here, at the bottom of the world, a joke was still possible. The cold snap passed, and the ship returned to its familiar, nauseating roll. The days stretched into weeks. We lost all track of time. Was it May? June? Had we been at sea for 3 weeks or a month? It hardly mattered. Our existence was measured not by a calendar but by the arrival of the food buckets and the slow, agonizing passage of our own discomfort. Men grew weaker. Some died, their bodies quietly removed in the dead of night. We became gaunt, hollow-eyed creatures, our uniforms hanging on our skeletal frames. We were no longer men, but ghosts haunting the belly of a steel whale. A kind of kangaroo court emerged in one corner of the hold, led by a fanatical non-commissioned officer who saw betrayal and weakness everywhere. He and his cronies would hold trials for men accused of hoarding food or collaborating with the guards. The punishments were swift and brutal. It was another sign of our decay, the collapse of civilization into tribal savagery. I watched it with a detached horror. This is what happens, I thought, when you strip everything away from a man, his home, his purpose, his dignity. The veneer is thin, and beneath it lies something dark and primal. One day, a new sensation. The ship's movement changed. The violent, unpredictable rolling gave way to a smoother, gentler sway. The engine noise lessened. A new smell filtered down into the hold. A smell of land, of vegetation and industrial smoke. A wave of excitement, the first genuine emotion many of us had felt in weeks, rippled through the mass of prisoners. We were arriving, where we did not know. Some said it would be the northern continent, others the southern one. The speculation was feverish. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard the rumble of the anchor chain. The ship was still. Then, with a deafening screech of metal on metal, the main cargo hatch was winched open. A rectangle of brilliant, blinding light appeared above us. It was so bright it was painful. We shielded our eyes, groaning. Fresh air, clean and cool, poured into our foul pit, and with it, the sounds of the world. The cry of gulls, the distant toot of a horn, the hum of a city. We were a pit of writhing, pale creatures, blinking in the sudden glare, like grubs unearthed from under a stone. We were ordered out, prodded up the ladders into the daylight. The sun on my skin was a physical shock. I felt dizzy, weak, my legs unsteady after so long in the confined space. I stumbled onto the main deck and squinted against the light, my eyes struggling to adjust. And then I saw it. We were docked in a massive harbor, a bustling waterway filled with ferries and tugboats. But it was not the harbor that held my gaze. It was the city that rose behind it. It was a forest of stone and glass, a range of man-made mountains that scraped the sky. Towers of impossible height stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows glinting in the morning sun. I had seen pictures of such places, but the reality was staggering, an architectural expression of power and wealth so immense it seemed to belong to another species. My amazed focus was on the mighty monuments of stone, which were still partially shrouded in the morning mist, weathered gray, cold, and foreign. This was the new world. This was the home of our enemy. Looking at those colossal structures, I understood with a final, crushing clarity that we never had a chance. This was not a country. It was a factory, an engine of creation and destruction on a scale we could not even conceive of. Our own cities, with their ancient churches and quaint town squares, were museum pieces by comparison. We stood on the deck, a ragged, stinking assembly of defeated men, blinking like owls in the sun. Civilians on the docks below stopped to stare at us, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and contempt. They were so clean, so well-fed. Their clothes were bright and new. Our clothing, by contrast, was nothing more than rags, stained with filth and sweat, our faces gaunt and bearded, our eyes hollow. A profound sense of shame washed over me, a shame so deep it was a physical sickness. We were a spectacle of misery, a parade of human wreckage put on display for the victors. We were herded down the gangplank, our bare feet or worn-out boots shuffling on the hard concrete of the pier. We will set foot without protection on the land of the victors. The air smelled of salt and coffee and exhaust fumes. It was the smell of a vibrant, living world that we were no longer a part of. We were marched into a large warehouse on the pier, the doors clanging shut behind us. Inside, we were ordered to strip. Our rags were taken from us, thrown into a pile to be burned. We stood there, naked and shivering, a mass of pale, emaciated bodies under the harsh glare of electric lights, as men in rubber aprons sprayed us down with a foul-smelling disinfectant from high-pressure hoses. It was the final humiliation, the ultimate stripping away of identity. We were no longer soldiers, no longer even men. We were objects, contaminated cargo to be deloused and processed. After the delousing, we were given new clothes, coarse denim trousers and shirts, stamped with large letters on the back. Then came the interrogation. It was not the brutal affair I had expected. I was taken to a small, clean office and offered a chair, a glass of water, and a cigarette. The officer who questioned me was a young major, polite and professional. He had a file on his desk with my name on it. He asked me about troop morale before the invasion, about the effectiveness of our coastal fortifications. His questions were academic, a historian gathering data. It was clear he already knew the answers. The war in the north was all but over. This was just a tidying up operation. I answered his questions truthfully. There was no longer any point in lying. The truth was as plain as the skyscrapers outside his window. When he was finished, he stood up and offered me his hand. I hesitated for a moment, then shook it. "The war will be over for everyone soon," he said, not unkindly. "You will be treated well." From the port, we were loaded onto a train. It was a passenger train, not a cattle car, with padded seats and large windows. It was another small, disorienting act of decency. We were each given a small box containing a sandwich, a piece of fruit, and a carton of milk. I stared at the sandwich for a long time before I could bring myself to eat it. It was made with soft white bread and thick slices of meat and cheese. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. The train pulled out of the city, and we began a journey of several days into the heart of the continent. I sat glued to the window watching this new world scroll by. The sheer scale of it was impossible to grasp. The farms were vast, geometric plains stretching to the horizon, dotted with enormous barns and silos. The towns we passed through were small and neat, with wooden houses and wide, empty streets. There were cars everywhere, gleaming and new. It was a land of incredible emptiness and incredible abundance, all at once. Who can measure the feelings and perceptions of this lost heap, this cargo of former soldiers rolling through a land they had been taught to hate, a land that now held them in its indifferent, powerful grasp? We finally arrived at our destination, a camp set in a vast, arid plain under a huge, empty sky. It was not the hellhole of mud and barbed wire I had imagined. The camp was a small city of clean, orderly wooden barracks, surrounded by a high fence, yes, but one that seemed almost perfunctory in the vastness of the landscape. The sun was hot, the air was dry. It was a world away from the damp, green coast where our journey had begun. We were assigned to our barracks, given clean bedding and regular meals. There was a library, a sports field, a workshop. The guards were few, and they treated us with a detached, professional correctness. Our new life began. A life of profound and aching boredom, of pointless routine, of waiting for a war that was already over to officially end. The physical misery was gone, replaced by a psychological one. We were safe, we were fed, and we were utterly, completely useless. I spent my days reading in the library and my evenings talking with Voigt and Keller. Keller, ever the organizer, was already trying to set up classes for the younger soldiers. Voigt had found a job in the camp kitchen, a position that gave him access to extra food and a renewed sense of purpose. We would sit outside our barack in the evenings, watching the sun set over the endless plain, the sky turning from blue to orange to a deep, star-filled purple. We talked about the war, about what we had done, about what it had all been for. We had no answers. We were survivors, but survivors of what? A shipwreck of our own making. We had been swept up in a great historical storm, and now we were washed ashore in this strange, quiet place, left to contemplate the wreckage. After my release in 1948, 2 years after Keller and Voigt, I did not return to my homeland. I settled in a small town in the interior of this new continent, a place not unlike the plains that surrounded the camp, and I took up my old trade as a teacher of history, trying to explain to young people the very things I still did not fully understand myself.